Welcome back to Recap Spot. Today we'll be recapping the fantasy adventure film, The Forbidden Empire. The film opens with Jonathan Green and his soon-to-be wife, Miss Dudley, as they're caught in bed by her father. Her father shames Jonathan for being a failure, but Jonathan insists that he's soon going to be a famous and successful cartographer. Jonathan makes a run for it from Miss Dudley's father and his guards, before hopping into his carriage and setting out for an adventure. Jonathan begins writing a letter for Miss Dudley, and he tells her that he's put all of his money towards an invention that will revolutionize cartography and reveal the true borders of the world. He rides out in his carriage from Greenwich and writes that he only wants his letters to be read by Miss Dudley, so he uses a mirror to write them in code. As Jonathan's carriage continues on its path, the film cuts to a voiceover as a man describes how young Slavic women have a tradition of floating lit candles on summer nights to try to find their true loves. Two girls, Panika and Nastasia, are taking part in this little ritual, when Panika suddenly goes missing, and Nastasia calls out for her. She eventually finds Panika floating in water, and she rushes over to help her friend. Panika suddenly springs to life and grabs the bottom of Nastasia's dress, and causes her to fall into the misty water. Panika goes back to laying in the water, and some lightning strikes a tree next to them and sets it on fire. Nastasia gets rescued by some weird creature with lots of horns on its back, and it sets her on the ground next to Panika. Panika is eventually found by her father, Sotnik, and he asks her who did this to her. She's almost delirious, and she tells her dad that someone must pray over her. She asks that Kama Brutus, a student priest, prays over her for 3 nights, and she then says that he knows who wears the sheep's skin. Panika then dies in her father's arms. A vigil is held for Panika, and Kama Brutus is brought to Panika's body to pray for the next 3 nights. Sotnik offers to pay Kama 1,000 gold coins for his nights of prayer, and Kama agrees. Sotnik leaves, and Kama begins his prayer, only for flowers to suddenly start falling from the ceiling. Kama quickly draws a chalk circle around himself, which protects him when a ghostly woman suddenly swoops down from the ceiling. The film then cuts to Sotnik as he hands the gold coins to Otets to deliver to Kama. Otets is enchanted by the coins, and wants to sue them to make a new church, but Sotnik tells him that the coins need to be delivered to Kama. We then see 2 brothers named Dorsch and Overko as they guard the building where Kama is praying over Panika. Otets approaches them with Kama's fee and gets the key to the building. When he arrives in the church, he finds Kama dead on the floor, and he shouts that the church is cursed and can no longer be called a palace of worship. The 2 brothers run in to help Otets and are convinced that Panika was a witch, and she must have killed him. The 2 brothers then begin trying to patch a hole on the roof, but a crow knocks one of them over and injures his eye. They rush down with Otets and inform Master Sotnik that they can never go back in that building. All of the villagers begin running away from the church, and Sotnik reluctantly leaves his daughter's body inside. The film then cuts forward 9 months, and we see Jonathan collecting wood in a harsh snowstorm. He's still writing letters to Miss Dudley. However, we see that she's now heavily pregnant. We then flash forward again and see her receiving another letter from Jonathan as she rocks her newborn baby to sleep. Jonathan is sleeping in his carriage one day when he meets some seminary students named Gorobets and Kalyava, who he lets ride in his carriage with them. They end up heading to the nearby village, and on the way it's revealed that they were friends of Kama Brutus, but they have no idea what's happened to him. The film then swaps to a flashback, and we see Kama and his friends Gorobets and Kalyava arriving at a house. They ask the old woman there if they can come inside, and she lets them eat, drink, and rest there. Kama goes to get some water and thinks he's seeing a beautiful young naked woman, but it turns out to be a trick. The old woman ends up attacking Kama, and she turns out to be a witch. As she torments Kama, it's revealed that the old woman is actually Panika in disguise. Back to the present, we see that Otets is having a sermon where he asks for God to protect them from what's locked in the old church. During the sermon, the villagers see terrifying images and are scared into following Otets' every word. On top of the old church, we see the strange horned creature from before. Back with the carriage, Jonathan doesn't believe the students' crazy tale, and he laughs them off. The 2 students decide that they don't want to stay with Jonathan if he's going to keep heading to the village, and they decide to leave. Jonathan then steps out of the carriage to pee, when his horses are spooked by some demonic dogs, and begin to run off without him. He runs after his carriage and is barely able to make it back inside without being torn apart by the dogs. Jonathan eventually makes his way to the village, but he ends up losing part of his special cartography carriage. Jonathan introduces himself to the townsfolk, and eventually he takes his carriage to be repaired by the town blacksmith. We then see Sotnik having a meeting with Otets, where he says it's been a year since his daughter's death, and he wants to have a funeral for her at the old church the next day. Sotnik then meets with Jonathan and asks him to make a map with the church at the center so that Sotnik can see all of his land, and he offers Jonathan 1,000 coins as payment. That night, Jonathan has drinks with some of the other villagers, and they get nervous when he mentions that he's heard of Kama Brutus. Dorsch and Overcoat tell Jonathan about the night they brought Kama to the church to pray over Panika. As Kama was praying over there, Panika suddenly got up and attacked Kama with branches. However, he was once again able to protect himself with the chalk circle. Jonathan asks the men where the church is so he can go there to make his map, and one of the men hands him some chalk to protect himself. Jonathan asks if there was any evidence about Kama's fate, and he's told that Kama tried to nail the coffin shut and pray over it that way, but he still ended up getting attacked. Jonathan finishes his drink and then starts seeing the men at the table turn into monsters. Jonathan hides under the table as the monsters try and hurt him, and he's able to protect himself in a chalk circle. Panika is there and calls upon a terrifying beast named V to help her see Jonathan. She then tells Jonathan that they need him to find who's inside of the sheepskin, and V says that if he helps them, then he will let Jonathan live. The next day, Jonathan heads to the old church, and some of the villagers run to tell Otets about what he's doing. Using a rope, Jonathan scales the side of the church and climbs onto the roof to get a good view for his map. Otets blackmails Overcoat and Dorsch into helping him because he knows they stole the 1,000 gold coins that were supposed to be given to Kama. So Overcoat ends up secretly spying on Jonathan, while Dorsch tries to bury the gold coins so that no one will find out they stole them. Otets has a sermon and begins to turn the villagers against Sotnik and Jonathan. Meanwhile, Jonathan falls off the church roof, but is saved by Petrus. They get back to the village and are pelted with rocks by all of the villagers at Otets' sermon. Petrus ends up getting kidnapped by Dorsch and Overcoat and is brought to Otets. Petrus is tortured for information on what Jonathan was doing at the church, and he tells them that he was there to make a map, and Otets commands Petrus to report anything he hears to Otets. Petrus returns to Jonathan and tells him he needs to run because the villagers are going to come after him. Petrus and Jonathan decide to hide out in a shack on the river with Nastasia, who has gone crazy since she was attacked by Panika at the beginning of the movie. Meanwhile, Overcoat and Dorsch fight over their secret gold coins, and Overcoat ends up running off. Dorsch looks for him but ends up getting killed by Overcoat, who's obsessed with the gold coins. Nastasia sees this and Overcoat pins the blame on her. When the angry villagers arrive to look for Jonathan and Petrus, they find Overcoat and Nastasia, and decide that she must be a witch when he tells them that she killed Dorsch. As Nastasia is hauled off by the villagers, Jonathan sees the horned creature and stabs it. However, he ends up losing his balance and falling in the water. Jonathan is about to drown when someone drops his bag into the water and Jonathan uses it to pull himself up. He sees that the horned creature is actually just a costume being worn by someone. Jonathan then heads back to the village and tells Sotnik that he knows what happened to his daughter. They then head out and see that the villagers are preparing to hurt Nastasia, and Sotnik tries to intervene, but he gets knocked unconscious. Jonathan is then thrown into a pit with Nastasia. He pulls a map out of his bag and sees that the supposed horned monster has marked down a path on his map. Otets intends to use Nastasia as bait to lure the horned monster out, and she's taken from the pit and brought to the swamp. A good villager helps Jonathan escape, and he finds Petrus and tells him to dress up in sheepskin to distract the villagers as they try to drown Nastasia. Petrus distracts everyone as Jonathan breaks into the old church and discovers that Kama is actually alive, and he was the one in the sheepskin. Jonathan thinks that Kama is the one that killed Panika, but he reveals that while talking to Panika, they were both attacked by someone in the sheepskin, and Kama put the sheepskin on and ran because he thought that Nastasia would assume he was the one who killed Panika. Otets then bursts into the church with an axe and attacks Jonathan and Kama. He explains that he was the one who killed Panika because she was a temptress. Otets puts Kama into the coffin with Panika and begins to nail him in there while Jonathan tries to call for help. Otets believes he's the new Messiah and tells Jonathan to read a prayer for the dying. Otets tries to attack him with the axe, but a crucifix falls from the ceiling and hits Otets. Meanwhile, Nastasia gets saved from drowning by Petrus. In a voiceover, we hear that Panika's body and soul are at peace, and her father is at ease. The villagers are back on Sotnik's side, and Jonathan heads back to Miss Dudley and her father, who now accepts him because he's been reading about Jonathan's heroism via his letters.